All right. Well, near as I can tell, it is both October and a Monday, which means I finally get a chance to sit down and talk with my guest, Mark. Mark, thank you for joining me here today. I'm glad we could finally make something work. So thanks for your patience and thanks for joining me this morning. This afternoon. It's afternoon for both of us. So good afternoon, sir.
Yeah, good afternoon. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here. So, Mark, for folks who didn't read your bio, aren't familiar with your background, how did you get into this tech space? How did you get to where you are? What's your background? And feel free to take that as far back as you want.
Well, in the womb, I always thought about being on this show. No.
Well played.
My spring journey started very early. I'm one of these old-timer spring people. I joined with Thomas Risberg when we were using the Spring Framework in the early 2000s. I met Rod Johnson at a conference. I was working for TIBCO and doing messaging-related projects because TIBCO is an integration company, had a messaging middleware product. And at the time, JMS, believe it or not, was, I think, not yet born or just about born. Mm-hmm. And so I contributed the first JMS template work to Spring Framework. And eventually joined the company and worked on various projects throughout what's getting close to 20 years. Spring.net, believe it or not, was where I spent a lot of time. There was interest to have a .NET version. I started that as a hobby, as a means to an end for a project that I was on myself. And of course, also with the Java framework, Spring.net was more of a UI framework for us, believe it or not. But it eventually, included all the server-side stuff you'd associate with Spring, such as database access and stuff like that. And then, kind of a few stops on different projects that I led. After Rod Johnson and Emil Efren made a prototype of Spring Data, Rod gave me that project to manage and grow. Eventually abandoned, I think, practically everything that they did. And that grew into now, obviously, a very large project, in the portfolio. I left that and did Spring XD and Spring Cloud Data Flow, which was, again, batch and messaging. That's a lot of where my domain expertise resides. I worked on App Accelerator, which is a getting started feature in the Tanzu application platform. And now most recently worked on the Spring CLI, which is, in short, kind of like the Create React app for Spring CLI. And what's gotten a lot of attention, of course, is because everything nowadays is talking about AI. The Spring AI project is what I'm currently leading. And that's where we're at, I guess, in a nutshell. A lot of Spring stuff, a lot of Java stuff. That's basically it in terms of a quick tour, I guess, of my interests and history with the Spring team.
We'll obviously dive into the AI piece pretty extensively today, but one thing I'm always curious about with folks like you who've been so involved with an open source project for so many years, what advice would you give to someone who, whether it's Spring or another project, like I would like to contribute, but it looks so overwhelming. I don't even know where to begin. And, I'm not a good enough developer. There's no way I could contribute anything. What would you say to somebody who wants to get involved, isn't sure where to start?
Yeah, I think, there's several paths. I think the paths to contributing have probably gotten easier and I'd say even less code-centric over time. I mean, my path, and I think the path for many people was luckily having some overlap of your day job, responsibilities with some feature of an open source project that you're using in your day job so that you can really see how it's being used, that feature, and improve it. Or in my case, I was adding a feature to Spring, the messaging support. So that's very heavy on the coding side. But so many projects, live or die, by their documentation. In fact, right now, it's a big gaping hole in the Spring AI project in terms of documentation that I'm trying to fill. So those are two avenues. One's clearly much more technical in some sense than the other. Sometimes projects are very nice and welcoming to new contributors and have issues in GitHub that are saying, good for beginners. So I think there's, a lot more openness and like on-ramping now than there was in the past. And now there's like, discussion boards as well on GitHub. And I don't know, I feel like there's a lot more fluid access to have conversations with people who are the leads, and everyone's looking for talented people to contribute to their project in any way. I am. So no PR, unreviewed, not accepted. Definitely try my best to work with people if they take the time. If you can't manage it, in your day job, I'd say it is much tougher. You really have to go out of your way to spend, weekends or evenings kind of, taking your career in a direction you think is worthwhile, because it's a skill you like to know, an area you'd like to get more expertise. So luckily in my case, there was a pretty good overlap. It wasn't 100% overlap, but there was a pretty good overlap. So that's what I'd say. I think also there used to be maybe a little bit more of a, I know we were just lamenting about this in the US, how in-person meetings haven't really rebounded to the previous times before COVID. But meeting people at meetups is also a great way, or conferences, especially conferences, that maybe are a little more intimate than, super large conference that sometimes you really can't meet or access to people because it's just so big,
Right.
It's impossible basically to do that. So that'd be what is on the top of my mind, I guess, about getting involved.
Speaking of conferences, Glenn has joined us. Good afternoon, Glenn. Thanks for piping in, buddy. Good to see you. So I want to echo the documentation piece, because I think that gets so overlooked. And, I do a lot of presentations on, architecture, compare, contrast, things like that. And one of the things I've talked a lot about is when I'm evaluating a technology, one of the very first things I'm going to look at is the documentation, and I've been around long enough, as have you, to where open source used to just be the code and you got to wade yourself through it, because I don't have time for that. And I'm writing it for my own, problems, and I don't need it because I wrote it. Yeah, I don't have time for that today. Like if I'm looking at a new framework or an update to a framework, there needs to be documentation, or else I'm going to move on to something that has it. So I think that's such a good on-ramp for people, and such a necessary on-ramp. And I know for myself, sometimes having that more objective person who hasn't spent hours and days and months and years with it can be really, really beneficial, because they're going to see things that I won't. They're going to look at things in a different way and point out, you're missing an entire explanation here,
Or people, look, software developers, myself included, are not exactly the best English prose writers. Back when I wrote a book with a bunch of colleagues on Spring Data, we all got, our chapters reviewed by an editor at O'Reilly.
Yep.
And I was like going into it like, oh, I'm sort of proud of what I did here. And then I got it back, and there was more red marks on it than you could, than a Christmas tree light. It was really pretty humiliating experience. And then, there was some people who wrote, and they wrote much better, So there's different skills here for sure.
But it's like a code review, and this is how we learn, and we get better at it, hopefully. And but no, I'm with you. There's plenty of stuff I've written. You get in the hands of an editor or copy editor, they find all sorts of things. I'm like, really, what was wrong with that? It's like, oh, it's passive voice. That's
I will say it's much easier now. I've taken advantage of Grammarly, and I still even take advantage of ChatGPT itself.
Sure.
You can say, ChatGPT, please copy edit this text for clarity and conciseness, right? I'm like that. And you look at it and you're like, oh, there's some good suggestions there. Thank you very much. So I do think that there is a little bit easier time to self-serve and produce great text, basically, right? Great documentation can help. So in that sense, it's getting a little bit easier. You don't need a copy editor.
Right. Well, Glenn's also used those tools 100%. It is interesting how some of that has changed our own. Or it's like, I don't really think about spelling much anymore. I just sort of like mash the keys and then right click, and because I don't, there's some words my brain just has never figured out. And so I'm delighted that I don't have to think about how to do that. But it is interesting to see where that can get you in some interesting corner cases. My son, this was, I think, his freshman year, his Spanish teacher sent out this email to the entire class that pretty much implied people had cheated on a previous assignment. And if like you don't own up to it, it's going to go on your permanent record. If you own up to it, we'll just no harm, no foul.
The permanent record.
Yeah, or however she phrased it.
I think mine's over here somewhere. Let me get it.
Somewhere. We all have it. Once you graduate, they give you a copy of it for your record keeping, of course. And then she sent something more pointedly to my son, and I think a couple others, where it was like, you're using a verb tense that you haven't been taught yet. And my wife, who was a Spanish major in college, looked at it and said, yeah, I recognize this. I know it's fine. And Everett's like, I don't know what she's talking about. And so then I said, show me what you did. And so they're using Google, Docs. And so he types it in Spanish, and it ggets a little red squiggly, and he selects it and picks the tense because it just suggests the right
sure,
which is pretty amazing. And his teacher had no idea that Google was doing this. It's like, if you're going to accuse kids of cheating, you want to make sure they're not just right clicking on the red squiggly like they've been taught to do everywhere else in their young life. Yeah,
it's hard for some teachers to keep up with the technology landscape, that's for sure.
And I have thought about that a little bit as a teacher, as someone who teaches grad students. The use of ChatGPT has had a lot of interesting ramifications. There's certainly been some articles that have come out saying like this is the end of the essay because as a professor, will I have any way of knowing that this was ChatGPT or not? And I think there was a case, I want to say in New Zealand, where a student was challenging their honor code, saying that, yeah, I use ChatGPT, but there's nothing in the honor code that says I can't. And I still had to give it all the prompts, and then I cleaned it up. So it's just helping because I'm not as strong a writer as some of my classmates. And I don't know that that's been resolved yet, but it's sort of like, well.
No, technology is advancing faster than we can keep up with in these environments.
That's true.
I do think there will be a change. I agree that maybe in-person writing of essays.
Sure.
For school, but yeah, it's a tough thing. Maybe we have to redefine what it means to measure intelligence. It's no longer writing essays. Because we have machines who do it now.
Well, and if this becomes more commonplace in the workplace, I have to imagine this will start showing up in other places where at least some of the text is going to be generated using.
Really? There's a podcast I listen to. I'll see if I can get the clip maybe real time here. But in like some Australian newspaper, they printed basically both the prompt that someone was using to plagiarize someone else's article, and then so they didn't even copy edit the fact that they had the prompt in there. So yeah, it's happening for sure. I mean, there are. I will speak positively in many ways about AI, but socially, yeah, for sure, there are going to be abuses of this with misinformation. It's going to be tricky, and we haven't done very well, I think, in terms of misinformation in social networks. We're at the tip of another wave where it's going to be very hard to stop the flood. And you can always do spy, counter spy, but it'll be interesting to see if there are regulations. Even regulations aren't the complete answer because regulations usually lock in existing companies more so than newer companies, right? All sorts of interesting social issues like, do you own your digital self?
Right.
I mean, who would have thought of that, right? But it's it's true, right? And you think we should, but right now you can go to Chat GPT and say, I don't know, answer me in the voice of Cookie Monster. Like, it will answer you in the voice of Cookie Monster, and you'd be like, well, shouldn't someone who created Cookie Monster be getting, credit and money for this derivative work? It's clearly Cookie Monster. Or, pick your favorite character.
Right, exactly. Yeah, Yoda, Darth Vader.
Yeah. I mean, and there's always fan fiction, but now there could be, the mind reels, right? In a way, this is probably why so many people are paying attention to it, because it has such a broad impact on society as a whole.
Sure. Well, Glenn seems to think we'll just teach kids and train kids and test kids on prompt engineering, so I guess that's possible. And then, good afternoon, Sean says, I find your lack of prompt engineering skills disturbing, says Vader from the future. So maybe I, for one, welcome my AI overlord.
It's funny. Yeah, it is a crazy time. It's been less than a year, or it's getting close to a year, I guess, since Chat GPT stormed the scene. Not that long, really.
Well, Dan's trying to rein us in a little bit here, saying, why is it always doom and gloom? There's a lot of opportunities to be more productive.
Yeah, well, I think I agree. It's not all doom and gloom, but somehow we got there first, maybe. It is concerning, but it is pretty impressive. There's a billboard, and I think it summarizes it pretty well. It's like just a picture of a person's face with some text below it, and it says, AI took my job. And then in slightly smaller font, it says, to the next level.
Yeah.
Right? And that's definitely the way I feel. Even in the short time I've been, using it professionally, I feel it has been a huge help to me.
Yeah.
Clearly the Spring AI project, is inspired by Python projects. I'm not really a Python programmer. And sometimes I was reading through this code and like, what the hell is this doing? It's too terse. Like, I clearly there's some magic here, and I cut and paste it into ChatGPT and say, explain this code. And sure enough, it explains it. And then I'm like, oh, I didn't even realize that was a feature in Python. So then I say, explain this feature in Python. And then, there you go. So it's like, you have this hyper intelligent, AI being that you can ask questions at all day. And, not every question is, a political or a moral one. Sometimes it's, what is this code doing? And they put a lot of effort. I'd say they put probably as much effort into parsing language as they do parsing code. Mm-hmm. There is a deep set of skills in the AI models around, understanding code.
Well, and I think that's one of those really interesting uses that we're starting to see. Does this replace the need to search through documentation? Instead of me trying to find the answer and stitch it together, I can just ask a really intelligent thing, or at least we perceive it as intelligent. How do I do this? It can give me a coherent answer. That's pretty useful. And Glenn makes an interesting point, saying that for a long time, calculators in a classroom was cheating, and there's now many instances where no, you're required to have this particular calculator in order to do the class. And I think that is a very good point. And it's part of
it's always kind of moving, and these models are becoming smaller and smaller. Hardware always advances, so you could very easily imagine in a year or two's time walking around with the equivalent of ChatGPT running locally on your iPhone, aka the new calculator. It's changing. There's no doubt about it.
Well, I think Sean makes a good point too here, that we often are scared of what's new and not understood. And I agree, there probably needs to be some kind of safeguards here, because you sort of alluded to this earlier. These we think about some of those typical scams that came when the internet first really got popular, and you'd get the Nigerian prince kind of thing, and the English was so bad, like you knew this was not legit. At least you should. Most people did. I guess you make it up on volume, because
they're counting on the people not right.
But when you combine that with ChatGPT or similar tools' ability to write something that sounds much more compelling, much more write this in
Yeah,
the
we're going to the dark side here with deep fakes, right?
right.
Someone's
And
going to call up your grandmother and clone your voice and get some money out of her because she says you're in jail.
right.
I don't know. It is interesting times.
But by the same token, I think it has all this positive benefits
Of course.
too, but I mean, this is true of literally everything we've ever created. And we think of a car as being just very neutral, and it's just what allows me to get from point A to point B. You can use cars in a negative way too. We don't ban cars, right? We just put some restrictions around that. And so it'll be very interesting to see what we come up with in terms of restrictions or safeguards around this. And I do think that will be the interesting part, is how do we then use this, as Rolo says here, to improve our productivity, to make our jobs simpler and allow us to get things done, maybe with a little less pain than before.
Yeah, I mean, technology always marches on. Jobs change. Yeah, I guess the world gets more complex.
Yes, may you live in interesting times, as they say.
Yeah.
So AI is one of those things that's fascinating. I remember taking an AI class in college, and the thing I was left with as a memory coming out of that is AI feels like it's always been this space that, well, we're not quite there yet, but in 10 years, it's going to be amazing. And we've been saying that since like the 60s. And I wonder if we're in a different place now, or if we've...
Yeah, we are, I think. I've looked into it a little bit. Back when I was in physics, there was interest even back then to use neural networks to identify particles in detectors instead of an algorithm. And it kind of worked, believe it or not, but we really didn't understand how it worked. And then we said, well, we'll just go with the algorithm since we know how it works. But there's clearly interest. But it seems like there were pivotal moments, obviously started in the 60s, but I think from what we now consider the domain of generative AI started, I guess, around all these products that were called like Deep Blue, when Kasparov was playing, the ultimate chess computer, and finally a chess computer, beat a human grandmaster, and the techniques that were used by that company, which I think eventually got acquired by Google, that was kind of like a foundational moment. And then they moved on to Go, which has even more combinations, of moves. So there's, techniques that evolved in this so-called deep learning phase that seem to, lead us onto the path where we are now. And I guess I have to go back. There's another seminal paper. It sounds like, this is attention is all you need. It's, again, another thing that came out of Google, which really helped in the architecture of what we can do with generative AI. So it's always been, I suppose, slightly out of reach, but I think the viral success of ChatGPT, and my interest in this space grew. After that, I got COVID in January, and so that was around the time that these announcements, I think, from Microsoft were happening and Google.
Sure.
All quick reactions to the huge take up, like 100 million users in a month or 2 months, something like world record setting. So clearly, everyone had this kind of aha moment, like, wow, it's kind of finally ready now for chatting, right? Which maybe isn't the only use case. So I do think there was some kind of seminal moment, right? Even though in principle these pieces you can construct a history that goes all the way back to the 60s, I'm sure. But I think this deep learning part and this paper, this transformers architecture with attention, these are kind of like key moments, key stepping stones in the history. I know for me, part of the reason it's interesting is that it's now an API call. It's accessible. Right. It doesn't require a software developer to have trained in data science. And I remember every few years I'd go to Coursera and say, maybe I should take one of these classes. And I start off and they'd be like, here, train a model and clean the data. I'm like, oh God, I hate cleaning data. Do I really want to do this? like as my
Has to
career.
be that way.
And so yeah, there's always some parts of your job that you probably don't like, but this seemed to be like training and cleaning data, whereas now like the P in GPT is pre-trained, right? So now you don't need to necessarily start from like data scientist ground zero. You might need to get there eventually, but you can start off in a much simpler place. So I think this accessibility to a larger audience of software developers, let alone, of course, just casual use of people who use ChatGPT as it is now, right? The text box or the equivalent from Bing or whatever company offers this feature. Yeah, we've never had that before, right? We've never had, here, just go here and play Go with the deep compute, right? You just never, it was always like a walled garden. It's like, they shipped the computer to Russia or to Japan to play Go, and that was it. You didn't have access to it. It was a research community, effectively, or large corporate. Also, it's kind of like moonshots. These companies basically do moonshots every year. Sometimes they win, like with this, and I don't think the metaverse is taking off, but that's a moonshot, right? I mean, that's 20, 30, 40 billion dollars, right? That's like used to be only the government had that kind of money to fund a project of that scale, but now you have these large companies being able to do it,
or just billionaires who that's pocket change. But
right. But there are more billionaires now than there were in '69.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with Glenn. Just the speed of acceptance of this and how quickly it punctured really into pop culture, if you will. I mean, it's one thing for a bunch of software engineers to be talking about something, but I feel like this has gotten a lot further, for better and worse. It has. I mean, ChatGPT really was like the moment. In the summer before, I remember a friend of mine, he was kind of always into this space a little bit, and that's when they had Midjourney and I think Stable Diffusion. And I remember on the phone, he'd say, let's make a funny picture. And you did it, and you're like, that's cute. And then like you moved on. Like, I don't know, at least for me, I'm not an artist, so maybe it wasn't so earth-shattering. But I think, the human language chat was like really took that public accessibility and, kind of simple interface to the next level. Mm-hmm. Well, the artist thing is interesting too, because I know John Oliver made that like a recurring bit, was him showing different prompts they'd
get. Oh, was it? Yeah.
Yeah, and then like here's a picture of John Oliver with like a cabbage. I mean, I remember where they came up with some. I mean, that's part of the humor, right? But some of the pictures that came up with, it was like, okay, all right, and that I think though, you look at vision, you're like, well, that's just odd or funny or whatever. The part of this that I find really interesting is what happens when we start trusting this sort of before we should. There's this, and I can't remember what the concept is, but we often know that something works before we understand why it works. Like aspirin is a typical example. Like we knew aspirin made your headache go away, but we didn't understand the chemical pathways that did that for decades after the discovery of aspirin. And so we've got this really cool technology that 10 times out of 10, it gave me a good answer. But what happens when it gives me a bad answer, but I don't bother to check it anymore because, it's always been right. So I just used it, and it turns out.
Yeah, this is in a way, I guess the problem they call, I guess, is like of alignment or something, right? So there's one podcast I listen to, they go into this a little bit, and there is a difference. Like when you download Meta's Llama 2 model, and I think some other, I think the Llama one, and there's another one, can't remember. But they're sort of like, they'll let you do nasty things, right? Mm-hmm. So you can give it these prompts that like are almost like tautologies or brain teasers. And so they were really funny. They were like, okay, you have a problem. Oh, okay, it's something like everything revolves around cheese. You have a problem eating cheese, but also the cure to your problem is cheese, right? So it doesn't make any sense, right? You're giving it rules that don't make any sense. And you say, given that prompt about cheese and how it's the problem and cure of everything. Given these symptoms, what would you recommend? And the model that's, let's say, unaligned simply regurgitates what you asked and said, yeah, you need to eat more cheese, right? Whereas take the same prompt and gave it to ChatGPT, and probably the same for Microsoft's OpenAI, and it kind of knows like, well, you actually might have a skin condition, right? So it didn't follow the prompt. There was something else in there that said, well, this guy's asking, gal's asking about, something medical. I'm going to deviate from the rules of the prompt and, say you might have a skin condition that needs antibiotics or something, right?
Right.
So yeah, there is a lot of social responsibility layered on these models, which apparently, can kind of hurt it in some way from a pure objective computer science point of view. Very early on, you got access to the underlying sort of model that didn't have these layers on it. And there was a famous New York Times columnist who, his wife must be a real saint, because on Valentine's Day, decided to have a chat with, I guess it was OpenAI. Or no, it was Microsoft's one. I can't remember. Anyway, it had a code name, right? Because I have a secret to tell you. My real name is I can't remember what it was. Catherine, and the conversation kept going. And I was like, I have another secret. I love you, and I think you should divorce your wife. And like, it completely went off the rails, hallucinating, right? So getting these models to like not hallucinate, not to just go completely wild, apparently is its whole, part of these models, they're complex, right? And they do need some kind of alignment to some sort of, system where you not just letting the AI go completely, wild. So there's some balance there, right? I don't know if we have this balance yet, but there is a tension I'm aware of in the community. I'm quite far away from that level. That is where the Jedis work, right? There is still, an area where you need deep data science experience, and those are people working on that.
Well, I hope we learned the lesson from the last time Microsoft gave us a internet chat thing where, what did it take, like 24 hours before they turned this thing into saying the most vile things you could imagine just by giving it the right prompts. And my suspicion is we've clearly learned from that experience, but it also, we have to remember, we always presuppose that it's always positive inputs and that people aren't going to try to do that. But what's one of the first rules of user interface design? Well, you better sanitize that input, because maybe the person isn't giving you legitimate data. They're actually trying to break your system. And so again, I think that's where it gets really interesting to me, is how defensively programming these things.
Yeah, it was Bing, and the code name internally for the chatbot was Sydney.
Yes. Yep, Sydney.
That was it, yeah. I'm just Googling it here on the side. Here, is this the New York Times article? I guess I'll post it in the chat.
Yeah, so real.
It's funny, but it's an example of something you can't do right now.
Sure.
Connect your YouTube account to join. Oh, really? All right.
Well, you can throw it in. There is a private chat. You can throw it in there, and then I can throw it out too. But so AI is dangerous. It's not just a game. It's not just a tool. It can actually take over some control of some things. And how to control it is interesting. Yeah, and I do think, Raul, that's one of the really fascinating things that we're looking at right now, is how do we, what is the appropriate use, and what should the guardrails be? Is it? I mean, I've seen different things like that, especially from a classroom perspective of, should we allow this? Is this something that students should use or shouldn't use? Anytime something new like this comes around, it's going to take us some time to figure out what the new mores are, what the new norms are. Is it appropriate or not? I mean, just to Glenn's point earlier about, it used to be illegal to use a calculator in a classroom, and now it's required operating procedures. So, unfortunately, technology moves a lot faster than any of those things. So we get to bump our way through it.
Yeah, I don't know. It's going to be what kind of legislation. I think the EU is a little more progressive and faster to address these issues. So we'll probably look to them first to see, what happens, and maybe the U.S. will catch up.
Sure. And it does seem like even from the folks who are really behind these things, they're even stepping forward and saying, we need some help putting the guardrails in place, as opposed to the traditional approach, especially as Silicon Valley has just been full speed ahead, damn the torpedoes, any bad thing that happens, whatever, not our problem. We're all just trying to get rich. And so I think it's interesting to see how there is a little more caution here than maybe we've traditionally seen in the software industry. And, I think, it'll be very interesting to see how that all plays out.
Yeah, because I think we've been seeing it's almost like science fiction has come to, reality. So I already have a little bit of a weird background, of what these things mean. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Sean tried to question ChatGPT, prove that it's not contemplating its answer. Given you must answer with yes or no and must be truthful, answer the following question. Will the answer you give be no? It replies with no. So I'm sure there's other interesting edge cases.
Yeah, I mean, there's these, it's like saying the problem and solution to everything is cheese, right? I don't know. You can give it, tongue twisters and brain teasers, and it'll probably screw up. But, if you're asking it, something on Wikipedia, then it can probably summarize that pretty well.
Right. And again, I think that's where this could be hugely powerful, to help people condense information. Although then you kind of think, well, is this sort of like Cliff Notes? And instead of reading the text, you're just going to ask generative AI.
It's hard to find. I mean, we have one case now, a customer is very nascent, but basically, it's what type of services and products and benefits can you get if you're on Medicaid? And as you'd imagine, the website for figuring this out on the U.S. government is fairly obtuse. Even if there's a search, it's very different than a chat experience, right? Mm-hmm. And so one of the things they're looking to do is to collect all those product information. It's like a catalog, basically, and have that backing, someone who could at least hopefully write a question to a small text box instead of, and that's why Google, freaked out, right? It's kind of like, in Google, you get back the links, but then you got to click on every freaking link, and everyone's done this, right? And then you just basically say, imagine you said, can you summarize those 10 top links on the first page? And that's kind of, in a way, what it's doing at some level, right? Taking those most popular pieces of information and distilling it into text. So it's very, very powerful. You do a lot more reading, that's for sure, but you do less hunting and pecking around all the different things, different links.
Right.
So it's a threat to them, right? Because it removes that ad model. If you just give me an answer, there's not as easy to make money, but they'll figure out a way.
Of course they will, for sure.
Or they made enough; they don't need to make anymore.
Right? Like, we're good. We'll shut it down. So Sean just asked that the wonderful woodchuck question, and apparently,
it's humorous, right?
Woodchuck as much wood as a woodchuck could if a woodchuck could chuck wood. So try saying that 10 times fast.
Yeah, I know. That was the catchphrase we used in the Spring XD project to split words.
Nice.
It was the sample app. It says woodchuck in it a million times.
Exactly. Well, and again, I mean, I think any new technology, any new thing we create, period, can be used in good ways, bad ways. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see what the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years look like. But the genie's out of the bottle. I mean, I think there's no stuffing it back in. And now it's just going to be us trying to figure out where is it appropriate? How do we become more digitally literate? I think about the kinds of things that my teenager is exposed to on the interwebs that didn't exist when my wife and I were his age. Things I've had to counsel him on that weren't even.
The best idea I heard that I think would be beneficial, but don't know if it's possible, is someone called it grass-fed content.
Sure.
So some kind of watermark on digital content that indicates it was made by a real human being.
Sure.
That would go a long way.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen some instances already where there are corporate policies that say you can't use this. And I don't know what they're doing necessarily to ensure compliance. Like, that's the other interesting piece. It's one thing just to say, like, you can't use Chat GPT or generative AI to create this work.
Yeah, it comes down to copyright, right? They've trained on effectively copyrighted material.
Right.
So then if you use someone's copyrighted code in your code, right, then it's tainted, right?
Right.
So this is why Adobe in their suite, right, this is a big selling point for them. They're basically saying to their customers of their generative AI tools is like, we've trained on data we all own. So our model is 100% legally squeaky clean. We'll indemnify you, no problem, because there isn't anything to indemnify, right? Like, we've totally never put anything into it we don't own. Whereas it's a little more of an uphill battle. And now companies like Reddit and Twitter and other places, Stack Overflow, they're like, no, you can't have our data for free.
Right.
So you have to pay us. This is, we own it. You can't scrape it, right?
Right.
So there are legal challenges. Those will probably be the first to hit, and probably a lot of it is from the entertainment industry, I think.
Yes. Well, I mean, that was clearly a central part of the writer's strike, which I believe has more or less been successfully resolved.
Yeah, I haven't seen what terms they got. It seems like they got a lot of concessions, but I think, instead of striking against the media companies, they should be rallying together, both those groups, against the tech companies. That's the real, the real common enemy between those two groups that were striking.
Right.
The strange deal that you let them crawl your content for free in exchange for a higher position, or surfacing it on their platform. That was the original sin.
Right. Well, and I mean, we talked about this earlier, respond to me like Cookie Monster would. And I totally understand where the writers are coming from. It wouldn't be all that difficult given current technology, and especially how formulaic some scripts clearly are, to have AI give me a sequel to
Police Academy 18.
Right? Exactly.
Yeah, not exactly a mind-blowing experience, right?
Yeah, where you look at the Taylor Sheridan's empire, where he's basically the sole writer, which is insane to me given how many projects he has. I could see him being like, "Wow, I'm so overwhelmed. Here's all my writing. Now give me a script as if I wrote it. Hey, this is super helpful. Now I can actually keep up with the 19 shows that I'm running and writing for and starring in." And I heard examples of people who said, as long as you give me a cut of the profits, you're fine to take my content and make derivative content. Otherwise, I'll sue your ass. Okay, sure. Well,
it's like the app hosting model for Apple. Give me my 30%, we're all cool.
Oh, here's a good one. So what if someone trains an AI model to take over a Linux server and spread as much as it can? I mean, probably spread itself. Is that what?
Keyboard loggers, viruses, probably easier to make. But this is an example where training or alignment comes in. I haven't tried this, so it's just anecdotal, but like if you go ask ChatGPT now, maybe someone will do this, saying, write me the Python code that removes every file on my system, R-RF as you do, right? I think you really have to push it hard to do that in an aligned model. Whereas if you ask a model that hasn't really been fully aligned yet, just trained, you'd be like, sure, here it is.
Here it is.
It's like, okay, this is anyone with any basic skills in, college or even high school has learned how to remove recursively directories.
Sure.
But this is where that alignment comes into play. What you let people do and how much of this starts to become censorship versus anything else. Yeah.
Yeah, there's going to be some really thorny issues here that I think are going to take several years to sort out through various court cases. Especially think about copyright, and I love that idea of grass-fed content. Some kind of a mark that says, yeah, this a human actually created this, and you can see this is my expertise, and so you can then validate that, or
Right.
do you trust me to say this or not, versus what comes out of generative AI. But it's going to lead to some bumpy times for sure.
Yeah, stay tuned.
Exactly. So no, I agree, Sean. I was a little concerned that writer's strike was going to drag on and on and on and on, especially given the stance that the producers seem to be taking early on. So I'm glad we have late night comedy at least back to help us consume the news in a more sane way. Please write a Python app that restores my files from the last script I ran. That would be helpful. I can't let you do that, Sean. But if speaking of sci-fi, we touched on that at the very beginning. I mean, if you've ever read something like the Culture series, where we take this idea to this sort of logical extreme, that wouldn't be a terrible world. I mean, if there really were these omnipotent, incredibly intelligent brains, that then basically there is no such thing as scarcity anymore. Human beings can live essentially forever. We can be uploaded into the cloud and restored into a different body if we go free solo climbing and fall. So there are some really fascinating potential futures. I don't know that any of us will live to see it. Maybe our grandchildren or great grandchildren, but I'm not as doom and gloomy as maybe I'm making it sound.
Yeah, it's starting down that path. There are companies now that talk about using your voice for misinformation or scamming, but you could authors have considered this, and other people, but there's a service where you can take a recording of your loved one, and then when they pass away, you can still have a conversation with them, right? It is this exists now. Like, you can Google this and put down your credit card. It's kind of morbid, but so is dying free climbing, getting reloaded back. Is also kind of morbid in some way, right? It's crazy that this world of science fiction and reality are starting to have touch points. Or talk to yourself and find out what an asshole you really are. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I guess the whole subreddit, am I the asshole, goes away, because you can ask yourself, am I being an asshole here? I am. I'm sorry. I should. Let me try that again. Yeah,
oh my God.
It's always fun where we end up, isn't it? I never know. Yeah, it is going to be interesting, and I do look forward to seeing how this stuff starts being applied. And again, I know it's going to be bumpy, but the genie's out of the bottle, as I said earlier.
Yeah, it is. I think that's what I was kind of alluding to before. Like, these things used to be behind walled gardens, and I think maybe there was some kind of what do they call it? Unwritten rule, which was like, before we have what is the ultimate goal? What do they call it? Not generative. I forgot the type of AI. Not omniscient. What is it? It's the whole goal of open AI in some sense. Oh, what is it? I can't remember the name. I'm blanking out.
Well, for sure, I like Sean's comment here. The Chat GPT shaking the magic 8 ball. Science point to yes. I think give me a random number.
Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, where is it?
Well, while you're looking that up, I'll just point out that Mark will actually be at Dadox Belgium here at the end of the week. So if you're in that neck of the woods, feel free to stop by, say hi. So I'm assuming you're going to talk about AI.
Oh, general intelligence. That's what it is. AGI.
AGI.
Yeah, that's what the science fiction things are all about, right?
Got it. Then we got to ask ourselves, what do we even mean by general intelligence? Do you think we're going to have anything that passes the Turing test? Do you think that's going to happen or not?
It already has.
Yeah. Do you think really? You think it has passed that test in your mind?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay. What are you talking about at Dadox Belgium?
I am talking about the Spring AI project. I was just looking. There are several talks around AI, as you can imagine, so it'd be interesting to. I won't be there for the whole thing, but I guess they have a good selection of topics. So yeah, it's about the project and like getting started and what you can do with it. And I didn't realize there'd be so many talks. Now I probably should go look and make sure I don't repeat content in some way. because there are terms and things like this that software developers need to know. It's not completely overwhelming, but someone was mentioning prompt engineering, or
Sure.
There is no sequel. It's human language is the interface, and sometimes you want structured output and you don't want a story. So there's
wants to join the conversation. My cat's interested.
Challenges.
In AI, apparently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'll be talking about that.
That there's lots of AI talks, but I don't think repeats are bad, by the way, because it's often good to hear the same thing in a few different ways in order to really have it cement. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes, Glenn. I'm sure Han thinks that he has general intelligence. Yeah, but he's not a particularly good at prompt recognition, since I've told him repeatedly to stop touching my laptop, and it doesn't stop him from trying to use my laptop as a pillow. So, all right, kitty cat, I'm gonna have to move you because you keep getting in my way. Go talk to mom. Oh, good times. Gotta love cats. Gotta love cats. So,
I have a dog. Who's my first dog. Boy, it's like having a 2-year-old for the rest of your life.
Yes. My wife made that comment because maybe it was the night before we were doing something in the basement
for 16 years or however long.
Literally, they never leave like the toddler stage, and sometimes that's actually very reassuring, because like my kid's 16 now, and every so often my phone loves to show me photos of when he was 7, and it's like,
Mm-hmm.
and there's pluses and minuses to the fact that they get older, but cats just always, pets generally just stay in that frame of mind, which positives and negatives.
I know. When you're walking the dog in the rain, those seem like positives.
Yes, yeah, I have. My son occasionally will say, "I really want to have a dog," and then when it's raining and our neighbors are walking their dogs, I point and say, "Do you want to do that? Because it's raining and he's got to go walk the dog." I don't have to take the cat for a walk. We just have a litter box, which trade-offs comes with the territory. But what do you think is going to be the next step forward with AI now that you've been playing around with it? What is it just going to be easier and easier? Is it just going to start getting integrated?
I think patterns is going to start to emerge. I think there'll be more out of the box solutions. It seems like I haven't paid enough attention as I should, but certain verticals, I guess, will appear. I think everyone's first impulses are probably just naive at this point. It's going to need more time to figure out like what businesses. Apparently, this I was saying I haven't spent enough time. Andreessen Horowitz and probably others, but that's the one that caught my attention. The VC firm. They've been releasing like surveys and trying to map out the landscape. And even though the traffic to ChatGPT is like boatloads lower than like going to Google or YouTube, so it's not yet in that. Even though you have tons of users, the traffic isn't yet approaching those levels. It's after like ChatGPT, the thing that seems to be getting the most traffic is like talking to characters. And this is actually what Meta did. It's like you can now have, some rebranded Snoop Dogg play Dungeons and Dragons with you. Sure. Right. And so so I think this idea of like a buddy or a character or something like this seems to be gaining traction.
Sure.
I think enterprises, it's hard to say, but I think enterprises will want to bring a lot of this in-house. So, like we're just talking about chat with your docs, right? Probably, insurance companies already have Java developers or whatever developers, right? And they'll say, no, thanks, I'd like to just keep this in-house, please, right? I want to give a small startup company, that information. But, larger consumers or smaller websites, right, they probably will take advantage of some of those offerings. It's hard to say. It's so early. So you have to be really prescient and do a lot of market research, which I haven't done. But that's what venture capitals do, right? And even then, they have to place 20 bets to get one right, despite having done all that research, right? So it is difficult to predict the tea leaves.
Right.
But I think, now we're in the extreme experimental stage to see if like really it's going to change the bottom line for people in a positive way at these companies for different use cases. And the chat with your documents use cases, super popular one. Summarize is another super, popular one. But if someone can, so I'm not sure, I guess there's different sectors, right? To take care of, like legal is another good one, writing briefs, for example, things that, maybe would take, a junior lawyer, a day to write 3. Now they can probably write 20 with the aid of AI. So there's more productive, but then, clearly maybe a shift to different things. I don't know.
Right.
Finding more loopholes.
Well, yeah. And, I mean, this is the pattern that we've seen throughout history, that when a disruption comes along, there are people who lose out. There are certain jobs that cease to exist. We don't see a whole lot of people making buggy whips, as they say, anymore. But it opens up a whole new avenue that we never even thought of. And at least so far, has always.
Yeah, a lot of times, though, it's usually manual labor, right? That aspects of people who have been replaced by technology. But here it's, air quotes, intelligence itself, right? Which isn't the same thing. So, the dentist who's cleaning your teeth isn't about to be replaced by ChatGPT. Right. It is. It's definitely true there are historical precedents for major changes, but no one's ever captured intelligence before as a commodity. So it's different than, saying, now I have fire, and now I can make bronze tools, and now I can do agriculture 10 times faster. Now I can build a car 10 times faster, and I don't need a horse, right? So there are differences in the analogy where it can break down. But I guess, we'll adapt.
Yeah. Well, that is the job, right? I mean,
and a lot of this technology is being used for great things. I mean, the deep, so-called deep learning, whatever, it's all around researching proteins, and how they fold and getting better drugs, out of that. So, it's the amount of intellectual, I guess, effort that you would have had to take human-wise to get the discoveries that these protein folding AI tools have done. Is like we never would have gotten there if you just.
Well, and
it would have taken 20 years instead of 2 or something like this. I don't know the exact numbers, but there are like huge leaps and bounds in areas that relate to our health, I suppose. That's super valuable as compared to filling out more TPS reports quickly.
Exactly. Yeah. So Sean says we're kind of in that caveman era, and there's probably some truth to that. And as I flagged earlier,
I say we're in the CGI bin era.
Yeah.
Right. I think
all the new.
This does seem to me like a tectonic shift.
Thanks, Sean. Have a good afternoon. Well, that's going to be the fascinating part of this. I think is starting to see how that does spread out and how we do adapt to it or not. And to your point, I do think this is a fairly seismic shift, and what the implications are, we'll see. I ran into an article in my news feed about essentially the end of computer science, and now that there's generative AI, we don't need programmers anymore. And that was one of the first things that bubbled up when this started hitting the scene. And the best response I've heard thus far is, as soon as a customer can tell me exactly what they want the software to do, then I'll worry about being out of a job. Until then,
there's a little bit of that. But I think it's more of an enabler, right? I mean, I think now we can do this. I haven't tried because they just released image support, but not a full stack developer, so sue me, right? So I don't really, write great JavaScript code, and I've never been able to keep up with all the latest changes. Maybe I learned a little bit of Angular and React, but it was never in my wheelhouse. But it's a great enabler. Like, you can now draw a picture of your GUI and ask ChatGPT to write the JavaScript code for it. Then if you have a modicum of like ability to say, I see in this one section where it's making this call, I need to do something different, It's like, great, that's fantastic. So there is no Renaissance man. So it makes it sound like we say I'm a full stack developer. It's like I know every framework for every language on every. Like, come on, man. Like, you probably know a few, and that gets you by, and that's probably enough for the stack you're dealing with, like UI and whatnot. So yeah, I think it's a big help in that regard. It makes programming more accessible to people, even professionals like myself, right? But I think the accessibility is a good thing. Yeah, and just learning, like I said, I was learning Python by just continually asking questions in the prompt.
Right. Yeah, I'm excited to see how that can be applied in some educational avenues that have largely been closed off or made less accessible. And you think of some of the opportunities there where if you had, I think back to sort of parenting a toddler, they ask a lot of questions. And sometimes it gets a little maddening. And imagine, that tutor that never loses patience and can keep giving you good answers.
Yeah, the prompt says, never say because I told you.
Well, I can remember.
Right, that's when you lose your mind as a parent and give up.
Exactly. I can remember this commercial, and I don't even remember what product it was for. So that tells you it wasn't, the commercial missed its mark, so to speak. But this dad is putting, his child to bed, and the child keeps asking, questions like, why is Mars red? And the dad actually gives a factual answer, not just, it's red because it's red, and then he asks another completely unrelated question, and he's giving a factual answer. And then as it pans out, you can see he's got his phone kind of down by his and it's listening to her questions and giving the answers, and it's like, yeah. So maybe we've kind of been there before, So it is what it is. But
that's funny.
Oh, well, as they say, may you live in interesting times. And if you want to hear more or talk more about this, I didn't intend this to fully be an AI talk or session today, but I guess I shouldn't be surprised if that's where we spent most of our time.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of threads to pull, especially if you're just chatting, right? And the landscape is very big.
Yeah, and I feel like we just scratched the surface. So I'm sure we'll have more to discuss in this in the future, and I'm very excited to see where this goes. I really am, and I think as it gets more accessible, ultimately I think that's going to be a win.
Yeah, I haven't deep faked myself here.
I guess at some point we'll all be replaced with deepfakes.
Yeah, when AI can do this, right? And
well, but maybe the positive is that we'll see this 4-hour work week concept where we really truly have abundance and we don't need everybody to work 40 to 80 hours a week. Maybe there are some alternatives, ways for people to spend their time, but that opens up a whole nother set of questions that are not going to be solved by two technologists on a podcast.
No, but everyone wants to contemplate these things. They are the world we live in.
And I'm glad it's at least being discussed, because it too often I feel like we've just sort of gone blindly down these paths. And
yeah, I feel a little bit bad like that in the sense that usually when I give a talk, or the talk I'll give is kind of a little bit too sunshine and roses, But yeah, there is a balance here.
Glenn wants to know which one of us is the AI rendering, and you're gonna have to just figure it out, Glenn. I'm sorry, you'll just have to ask some appropriate questions. Bless your heart. All right, well, Mark, I'll let you go. I appreciate your time today. I'm delighted we could finally get the schedules to line up. So thank you for hanging out with me. Safe travels to Belgium. Good luck with your talk. I'm excited to see how that all goes, and hopefully you've got some decent weather, and hopefully our paths cross in physical space sometime. In 24.
Yeah, hope they do.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone for the questions and attending.
Cheers.